or some type of percentage, and it goes into the CAF. And so that's one way that the city is able to get money from developers that choose not to put in deeply affordable units into their property. And sometimes that money is used for tenant vouchers and things like that. It also goes to supporting CRHA, and I know PHA got some money from the city from that fund, as well as Habitat, like all of that stuff. I'm wondering, the issue with that is people aren't paying enough in there, and the fee that folks have to pay to opt out of building affordable housing units, like it's pretty much just like an incentive to not really build them. Like it's cheaper to just pay into the CAF fund than build a deeply affordable unit. And so people can easily opt out of it. And so I'm not sure if that's what you meant by a preservation fund, or is that an idea? Okay, so you're shaking your head no.
No, but it's related, and this is what we want to talk about. So what you're talking about is a fee, an in lieu fee. So either you build the affordable housing with the property, or you pay a fee into the CAF. And then that money then the money in the CAF could get deployed for a preservation fund or gap financing for a low-income housing tax credit. So really what I hear you talking about is a potential funding source, and saying, what I think I'm hearing is that we should raise the fee so that either we're getting more money or they actually build the units on site. We're not charging them enough.
Right.
And so the piece that we're talking about that's most related to that is an inclusionary zoning policy, which is under the land use. That's a land use tool, but we have the ability to jump over to other tools. So I'm not going to jump into it right this minute, but we can absolutely go look at that.
That's it. I just thought because it was money and had to do with the fund that it would be under subsidy, but it's a different tool. Okay.
Well, the CAF is a subsidy tool, but the process for paying for it is a funding tool, which I'm parsing a little too much, I'm sure.
I also think that the condominiums or whatever that Chantal's talking about, if it's a $1 million condominium, let's say, on the downtown mall, they're not going to put that to a low-income house. So they can opt out of taking that $1 million condominium and maybe put up 30,000, right?
Yeah.
And then build that house 5 streets away.
Yeah, that's another thing that they're allowed to do. Right. Yeah, it doesn't have to be on site, can be off.
So there is no way anyone would opt out to putting an affordable housing unit, if you will, in these expensive buildings that are being built.
I mean, they will if you set the fee high enough, but I'm not saying that's a good policy.
Well, it'd have to be set really high, wouldn't it? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, but like, there are plenty of communities that have set it that high. I'm not saying that's a good policy. Like, I'm not arguing in favor of that, but you can do it. It is possible to do. I'll just leave it. It is a possible thing to do. But let me.
What would you set it for? I'm just curious.
So basically, I mean, this is a good thing. So we do this analysis for inclusionary zoning policies. You look at the pro forma for the developer and you do your own analysis. So how much does it cost to building it? How much money are they going to make off that unit? Right. And then you figure out how much profit they're going to, like, basically how much loss they'll experience by making an affordable unit. Mm-hmm. And it's both the loss on the affordable unit and if you think it'll cause the other units to sell at a lower price because it's affordable. Mm-hmm. You figure out basically what the cost is to them, and you build a financial model with them. Then you have that number. Then you multiply it times 110 or 120%, so it's more painful to not build the unit, and then they build the unit. But that can also lead to less development, which sometimes is a good thing and sometimes is a very bad thing. And so we did this analysis we're doing it right now for the city of Alexandria. We did it for New Haven, Connecticut. We did it for New Orleans. We're doing it for Prince George's County. Different communities have really different positions on this. Prince George's County believes they need the development. I think some folks who we're working with in New Haven would like to see nothing ever built again, and are happy to crank the fee as high as they possibly could. Generally, we don't think that's a great approach. Is that helpful? I feel like I talked a little bit in a circle there. Was that at all helpful?
Now, is it better policy to insist that the affordable units be built on site? Or do you care if more units or more money is spent if it's on land still in the city, but a couple blocks away? Just from
So
from a policy
I'm gonna argue, so I'm gonna answer with a bunch of questions back, but hopefully they're useful questions. So it's really a normative values decision. And so here's the thing, if you choose to push it on site, what you're getting there, the advantages, the reason to do that is you're getting mixed income housing, or you're getting affordable units in areas of true opportunity.
Right.
Because the market has told you this is an area of true opportunity. The market, we can create maps and studies, but the market is much better at figuring out what the best place to be is. That's what the market's the best at. So that's one reason to put the unit in there. Another reason to put the unit in there is the property you put it in is basically, that supports the affordability of that unit over time. So there's not as much need for ongoing public funding. And so it becomes a much more sustainable and long-term affordable housing unit. So that's the positives to putting it on site. You get truly access to areas of opportunity, and you get almost permanent affordability. The other side of it, the debt. So if you want to go for more fee money, the reason you might do fee is you will almost always get more units that way. You can almost always produce more units that way because the fee can be high enough that you can leverage. Again, we talked about the low-income housing tax credit money here, or you can use the money to help pay for public housing redevelopment. So the funding generally is going to produce more units. The other reason you might look at funding being an option is tax credit. This is what we're talking about really, is an inclusionary zoning unit, IZ, inclusionary zoning. Those units, even if they're affordable, often do not go to the existing residents in that neighborhood because those residents still have to pass back, rental applications and background checks that weed off a lot of existing residents. So inclusionary zoning policies are not, they can be with careful design, but generally not great at preventing displacement. You would be generally, if you took the money and you use it up to buy up existing properties and allow existing residents to stay or help them have down payments, it's better at anti-displacement. So, you generally get more units and it's generally more effective for anti-displacement, but it doesn't really help, funding doesn't really help you with access to opportunity and mixed income. And frankly, the biggest downside to funding is the political drawback. It's hard for elected officials to approve new development in communities that are facing gentrification pressure. And if they can't say directly that people are getting affordable units along with this deal, it's harder to allow any deal to go forward. So part of the reason that we see, a factor in the reason we see inclusionary zoning is simply just the benefit of being able to clearly make the case, hey, we are creating some affordable units with this new development. What we approved wasn't just $1 million condos, it also was affordable housing. So anyway, I talked a lot there. Was that helpful?
Yeah, but what they did in Charlottesville this week is have a developer do the affordable units in $1 million location, and they only had to keep them affordable for 6 to 8 years. So, I think this is an interesting thing in Charlottesville that they struggle with.
Yeah.
I don't see addressed here in our work. Do you know?
So it is addressed in our work. It's just we'll go to land use. So this is inclusionary zoning, create a mandatory inclusionary zoning policy. And I'll go down into land use.
That's a lot, all this. I don't get
Yeah. It's a lot of materials, but we're never going to cover all of this. It's so that whatever topic you all want to talk about, we can get into detail on. So we're looking at Charlottesville should create a mandatory inclusionary zoning policy. That is our initial recommendation, so that it's not discretionary, negotiated by deal, but there should be a mandatory policy in place. This is something that had not been legal in Charlottesville until recently, but new legislator, new rules. So we do think a mandatory policy makes sense. But there's, inclusionary zoning, it's a predetermined percentage of units in a new housing that are set aside for income eligible household, but there can be in lieu fees or, alternative unit requirements, or frankly, a combination of them. You can do almost any complex mixture you'd like. It only works in a market with a strong multifamily market. So part of what's got to change for Charlottesville to actually have an effective inclusionary zoning policy would be you'd have to be developing a significant number of multifamily units, because it's only going to be at the highest level you're going to see is 1 in 8, 12%. So, to get a significant number of affordable units, you have to have a market that's producing a fair amount of market rate units. So you need to be producing hundreds of market rate units a year in order to get dozens of affordable units.
Probably not going to happen here, I would guess. Hundreds, thousands, yeah.
Hundreds, hundreds might get you dozens. Thousands would be tough for your market, I think.
That's because you don't want to you don't want to de-incentivize building.
Well, the deals can't support, there's not enough profit in the deals to support much more than 12%. Okay. So if you go higher than 12%, you have to give tax abatement, or the deals don't pencil.
Okay. I'm so sorry for dragging us into
No. This is great. This is
interesting to me.
This is exactly what we're supposed to talk.
Well, by not having
work for you guys.
By not having a clear policy, they have lost some opportunities here.
So what I'm hearing is you all want a mandatory policy, but you're not sure whether it should be how fee-based versus on site. You're open to a discussion on that, and push back if I got that wrong.
No, you're right, but I happen to represent the other side. I represent the people building these.
So do I sometimes. That's nothing wrong with developers. They tend to show up in BMWs and say things they shouldn't say at community meetings, but they're not.
I try to quiet them down. But the point is that they don't know what the policy is. And by not knowing what the policy is, there becomes division, where if people knew what the policies were, if it was a mandatory inclusionary zoning policy, I think people would figure that out. That's just my sense. That's my two, and there would be more.
And that's why we're saying a mandatory policy, because a mandatory policy is standardized. The other thing that we like about a mandatory policy and why we're recommending it is more of the cost gets priced into the land value.
Right.
And, we know the city likes land value because it supports tax base in general, but generally this actually is a positive for everything. The more it gets priced into land value, because it doesn't stop development that's going to happen and we generally want to have happen. And it gets you an affordable unit. So a standardized policy we think is the best approach. Now the hard piece is every deal is deal by deal. So you have to, but on inclusionary zoning, what I hear you all saying is this is a priority tool. And the key issue here is
I think so.
Having a conversation about how we're balancing the priorities.
Well, and the other issue is from you coming in here is that it's not consistent. Every time you get a new city council or somebody gets a real bug that they want something, there's no way to determine what's going to happen.
So let's talk about, you guys didn't want to talk about subsidy, you want to talk about land use, which is great. So multifamily by right zoning. In 15 minutes, I'm going to make you talk about subsidy because we have to, but we're going to talk about zoning for a minute more. So part of what we're suggesting is multifamily by right zoning. Charlottesville has an extremely discretionary policy, and that Charlottesville is not alone in that. But that's it causes a lot of issues is because it's extremely discretionary, developers don't know what they're going into, land is often not appropriately valued. But there's a perception that developers are getting an inside track, an inside deal because rules are being changed for them, even if actually that was what was always intended, because the rules actually aren't very clear. So there's both the fact that developers sometimes are getting deals they probably shouldn't, and the fact that there is no process to do it other than that way. So therefore, every developer is basically in that process. So what we're trying to do here is ensure that multifamily development is feasible by right. And by right means there's the minimum amount of local discretionary approval, which means neighbors, and I want to talk about the negative side of this. That means neighbors and community members have a very limited ability to block deals, projects, and developments because they don't like them. Right. That once you identify, not everywhere, but once you identify areas for by right multifamily housing, It's basically something, if you own that land, you have the right to do. And
Mhm.
so we want to make sure that where right now you have areas that are zoned for multifamily housing, but it's not really by right because you don't actually allow enough density to actually build it. So we want to change the rules. So where right now in Charlottesville, where it says multifamily can be built, you don't need to go get a special exemption, a special use permit. Is that the right term, Brenda? Special use permit. Thank you. You don't have to go get a special use permit. Like where it's zoned, you can basically actually do it by right. The other piece is we want to identify more neighborhoods that would allow multifamily by right. So both where it exists right now, make it easier to do, and allow it in more places. And that means eliminating discretion. That means eliminating discretion. Part of what we've gone here is like, you're right, Charlottesville isn't going to do thousands of units. But this is where we get into this regional point. Charlottesville is part of a regional area, and the urban ring around Charlottesville that has zoning that overlaps between the city and the county and is a little more complicated, has a lot more development potential. Frankly, is actually larger than the city of Charlottesville, has much more development potential, and there really is the ability to do that. And so any change in the multifamily by right process should also include the urban ring. The city should not just look at itself. Now, there's a bunch of issues that come with this, the change in zoning, and I want to talk about them a little out of order. Like when you change the zoning like this, and we'll talk about where we want to look at it, where you allow multifamily to happen that does not currently happen right now. So the areas where you allow higher density or more multifamily to occur, that creates market pressure, and that can create displacement. Like, I want to say it directly, like that can create massive displacement pressure. And historically, and this is true in Charlottesville, and it's true everywhere I've ever worked in my whole career, and every piece of analytical analysis I've ever seen, is that areas with basically industrial areas or areas with no residents are targeted, and areas that are communities of color are targeted, because those are areas that cannot organize to resist. So why should industrial areas sometimes resist? Because that's where people get jobs. So like there's a reason why you might not want it. So that's a real challenge here. So we wanted to look at this tool, and I got some questions later here. It's a lot of questions because this is a complicated tool, but is this a tool? Is how this tool works clear to you both, and how it supports or does not support affordability? Because we did this a little out of order, and I haven't talked about that as much. Like, is what I'm talking about clear, just as a concept? Like I've talked a lot. Sometimes I don't say things clearly. If I'm not being clear, tell me.
It's clear, but what piece is being left out of this which changes, is the political landscape. And I think people would much more, they would be happy to know what the rules were, but the rules change from week to week, literally.
So by right means your council would have less ability to change them, significantly less ability.
Actually the people I work with would prefer that.
Right, but I mean, Chantel, Susan, like how would the community, like,
Yeah.
not everyone's gonna love that.
Wouldn't you set it appropriately to get the results you wanted? So there wouldn't be as much guesswork, that you'd get what you wanted. No?
That is what we're recommending here. But Chantel, I want to hear what you had to say on it. That is exactly what we're recommending.
Oh, okay.
I'm like still learning, so I hope that I'm processing what you shared. I currently have, I don't know if you all have read the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition's report that they released in February of 2020.
Yeah.
But all that I really have to say, I feel like, is in this report. Mm-hmm. And the way in which they explain the need for rezoning, especially the way that Charlottesville, like a lot of other cities, I was mostly, I guess I was really disappointed to see that our city's zoning map was based off of a really racist Bartholomew map, and that stuff is still here today. It's not surprising that that's what it is, but the fact that we haven't changed it in a very long time, it disturbs me. So when you're talking about multifamily by right zoning and explaining that folks that have organizing power, I'm thinking about the R1 zoned communities that may want to keep those things the way that they are, how that might impact things not going as we would like them to. And then when you also explain the ones that are currently zoned for multifamily facing more development pressure, which is what we're dealing with right now. They are historically marginalized Black and Brown communities. I still am hesitant around it. I know the language in this report is slightly different from what you have here, so I want to reference it, but I also don't know if I'm understanding everything that you just shared correctly, because maybe I misunderstood what I'm reading here, or maybe
No, I think you understood. And so I think you understood the concept of if we upzone, like the existing process has a racist past. The origin of zoning was a tool used to perpetuate racial segregation. And those zoning maps still either exist or underlie it. Yes. And so what we're talking about doing is changing where we'd allow multifamily by right. And so we took a first cut at this, at a very rough process. And you all get a copy of this, you'll get to look at it more. But really with the idea of, okay, if we were going to look at this with more of an equity lens going on, where would be single family zone parcels within a quarter mile of a transit corridor near employment centers and that are not primarily low income? So low income, we are not going to put pressure on any low income areas. These are only existing areas. Like, that doesn't mean we're saying this is the right map, but we're just starting this as an exercise of where is there the opportunity to build this kind of housing? And if we were going to do that and make sure we didn't put pressure on communities that were low income. I know low income and communities of color are not equivalents, but we don't want to put pressure on low income communities, period, because that's, even if they're low income white communities, that still leads to displacement.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying that this is a political feasible map or any stretch of imagination, but
Okay.
curious, like if you looked at this quickly, any initial thoughts of places that are, and you'll get a copy of this so you can think about this and make comments more later, but are there places that you see on here that are, oh, those are areas that we should really be thinking about more for multifamily that should be included that are missing?
So I'm like having to get really close to what you have because I can see that.
They're looking at Preston Avenue more, I think, aren't they?
Preston, okay. And why Preston Avenue?
Because there's space and room, and the land value isn't as high there. I think they have run into stumbling blocks to build affordable housing when the land value is so high.
This wouldn't be affordable housing. This could be market rate housing.
Oh, market rate. Okay, I apologize. Okay, I thought we were talking about affordable housing. Okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like downtown, there's no way people can build affordable housing there without a different way of looking at it. Because the
right,
land,
they'll need subsidy. But
right.
What about places with multifamily, like apartment buildings, like market rate apartment buildings?
I think this map is doing a good job so far. I really can't see everything, so
I won't quote you all on this. I won't hold you to it.
Yeah,
You're going to
man,
get a copy of this map.
but I understand the underlying premises, and I agree with what you just shared. So,
Okay. And
yeah.
we'll share it, and we'll come back and have more comments. Because we're running a little low on time, I'm going to go back to subsidy. Don't. I'm jumping all around. Don't get dizzy. So we talked about some of these tools. I want to go back to this. So the gap financing for tax credits. Let me just go into the more detailed versions of these. I won't go through them in detail, but this is basically the money that goes in to make low-income housing tax credit developments possible. So these are the new apartment buildings that are affordable rental housing, but they're not public housing.
Mm-hmm.
That's one tool. Then there's the public housing redevelopment that's going on between the city and the redevelopment authority. And there's a preservation fund, and this one wasn't as clear. So like imagine an apartment building. Here's an example in Minneapolis. You have an apartment building. Now there's not a lot of 240 unit apartment buildings in Charlottesville, so my apologies for that example, but just stick with me. It's an existing apartment building. It's relatively affordable currently, but there's a lot of market pressure. The idea is that you have a nonprofit or a mission-based organization buy the property, you put public money in there, and then you'd use money, something like Chantel, to your point, like the CAF would actually provide the funding to help them buy the property, and they'd buy the property and the rents, basically the rents wouldn't rise on that property going forward. You'd take it essentially out of the market. So that's what that's what we have for a preservation fund. It's about buying existing apartment buildings and taking the market pressure off of them.
I understand now.
I did a bad job of explaining it previously.
Yeah.
Wasn't my greatest. So these are the tools we're looking at on the rental side. I guess looking at just these tools on the primarily on the rental side, are there, from your experience, and it's okay, like gap finding for tax credits, public housing redevelopment, preservation fund, which of these would you push towards being higher priority? And so if you want to say you're not sure on all of them are priorities, that's fine. You don't have to take a position on this, but I'm curious, like if any of these seem like obviously but more important.
The housing authority was able to hold, were able to finance what they were doing with tax credits. I mean, they didn't have the money. So
they were able to fund it, what they're doing with tax credits,
right.
Extra money from HUD, and a bunch of philanthropic money, and a
Right.
bunch of money from the city.
Right.
It took a huge amount of money. It's very expensive.
But the driver was public-private, which was interesting. I'm sure you deal with that all the time, but I don't think it would have happened without the private part.
So none of these are possible. So the tax credits require private developers. All of these require public-private partnerships. There's no. I'm going to eat my words. There are no affordable rental housing being developed without public-private partnership. I think that's a true statement.
But I was saying, you and I are on the same page. And I think that could improve. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Are there any, Chantel, the housing redevelopment, just going, you cited the report. Obviously, that's a high priority then. At least it's a higher priority in the report.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the priorities. I mean, the report's also talking about Habitat and Piedmont Housing Alliance. So like, definitely.
And so, and this is where I'm like, the authors of the report may not love me. I agree with their point that all of those are important, but I'm trying to get a little bit towards where are we going to put the emphasis on? Like if we had a limited amount of funding, which we do, it's, are there particular tools that you would prioritize? And the answer I think right now is everything's a priority. All of these things seem like they should be addressed.
Yeah. Philip, you are not going to make me choose between those things.
That's totally fine.
I don't know. Brenda Kelly's on the line. Maybe she'll.
Brenda has opinions, but I think she's got to be quiet right now. But she gets to tell me her opinions separately.
Well, I think what's happening is they're finding out what Chantel is saying, that these are all good ideas and we're not going to prioritize, but there's not enough money.
No, I understand when I have to be forced to prioritize.
We just need more money, don't you think, Phil?
We just need more money. We need a lot more money.
So let me talk a little bit more through the tools, and we can talk about the more money piece.
Okay.
But remember, like, just going back to the trade-offs here is like, more money means either more taxes or taking money away from something else. That's what there's no magic money.
Darn.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there is magic money, but it involves felonies, and we're not doing that.
Yeah.
I think that's what the cities, people know how much it costs and they know what they want to do, but the pot of money it's not as big as some people think it is. Do you know what
yes. Affordable housing is expensive.
Right. It's
affordable housing is very expensive. It's housing.
Right.
Building a home is not cheap. So there's other sides, access to affordable home ownership. So we just talked about rental, access to a single family infill development. So that's, you know, you mentioned Habitat. So that's like Habitat for Humanity, building new single family homes, you know, other folks do it. There's owner occupied rehabilitation assistance. So that's existing owners making sure there's rehab of the properties. There's down payment assistance. So that's helping new homeowners access home ownership. And then there's property tax relief. So that's making sure income qualified existing homeowners don't have to pay as much existing. Of these, are any of them you think particularly important? Not saying the other ones aren't important, but do any of them feel particularly important? Well, one, are all of these clear? I'm happy to talk about them more. I feel like these are clear, more clear than the rental ones.
Well, I think the city uses property tax relief to sort of put a stop to gentrification. Is that so?
To take some of the pressure off.
So I think the city in general, residents think that's important because, whoops, sorry, they want to keep people in their homes. Is that fair to say? Yeah.
So I agree with that. I'm not sure how many people are aware of that program to help, and how many are able to tap into it. But I do think that's fair to say.
But I want to just dig into that, what you just said. So again, putting words in your mouth a little bit. I'm not even gonna say I'm not putting words in because I am putting words in now.
There'll probably be better.
Right. You both said property tax relief is important. And Chantel, you said one of the things that needs to happen to improve it is basically the community engagement, the outreach and intake process. Everyone who's those are eligible and need to make sure that they're actually getting the support to access it.
Yeah.
Is that what I heard?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, you guys got to remember that, because remember, one of you two is going to have to report out on all this.
Not me.
No, we're not doing that.
I talk too much. You don't, like, it doesn't count as community engagement. I'll get in trouble. Brenda will get mad at me. I'll get in big trouble if I'm the one talking. The point is for the community to talk.
I think they also get a lot of private money or raised money, donated for
Philanthropic, yeah.
For the rehabilitation assistance. Do you think that's true? I mean, I think that's basically.
I think that there's definitely fundraising on that side, and I think Habitat raises money. Like,
right.
On the down payment assistance side,
Mm-hmm.
and for the owner occupied, really for all of these, with the exception of the property tax relief, one of the pieces we're going to talk about is the commitment to affordability. And so, if you give that assistance, so you sell someone a house or you give someone, money towards their purchase of a home, what do you like? Does that mean that home has to stay affordable forever? Does that mean that home, that the money given to them has to be repaid when they sell a home? Does that mean that actually the money given to them is forgiven and they get to keep it if they stay there long enough? And there's different approaches to how you take that. We're generally making a recommendation that the money you receive should be repaid when you sell the house, so that money can be used to help somebody else help support additional affordability going forward. I'm curious if you all have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think Habitat has a sliding scale, don't they?
I think they do. I
Right.
think what we're recommending is a little different than them.
Like, you can't move out next year and take all the money, but.
But you can move out in 5 years and take all the money.
Right.
So that's a forgiveness option. And so that, the advantage of the forgiveness option is it helps a household build wealth, which part of the goal for all these programs is to close the wealth gap. So that's great. The downside of that is the house isn't affordable for the next household. So it's this tension you're trying to balance of, like, you want households to build wealth, but you also want the house to remain affordable so that, the
Right.
next family who's lower income who wants to move up to ownership has the ability to access it. And forgiveness is best for for wealth building, but worse for affordability. And requiring the property to stay affordable in perpetuity is the best for affordability, but the worst for wealth building. And requiring only the money that was given to be repaid is in between. And there's a lot of wrong answers, but there's not one right answer.
So with that scenario, then, is it Phil or Philip?
I'm good with both.
Okay.
You won't
what's a good balance? Because I know like Charlottesville has basically zero Black middle class. Like it's just non-existent. And so I do think there's a need to like build wealth and help people to stay around. I mean, even myself, I struggle with wanting to stay in Charlottesville, just knowing that like, you know, I mean, honestly, I'm a millennial. I have a lot of debt. This city is too expensive. I love it. I love Charlottesville. I love going to UVA. I love the 9 years I've been here, but like, it's not a good starter city if you're trying to like build wealth, especially within the work that I like to do and I'm inspired by. There's not a lot of opportunity for me to be a homeowner, and I don't see that in my near future if I were to stay in Charlottesville. So, you know, there's not that many options for me. Like my options are throwing money down the drain, renting a house that's really expensive, and not being able to save because my loan payments for my graduate school degree is $1,000 a month on top of rent. That's around that amount as well. And I'm sure people love me, but I'm not like somebody who's collecting riches from my job. So what's a good middle ground for like someone like me if I was even hoping to buy in the city, knowing that I don't have a lot of, you know, wealth assets to build off of?
So let me, I mean, this is exactly what the down payment assistance program is trying to get at, is making sure there's a racial equity point here. Is like, there's less ability to borrow from family members because there's a huge racial equity gap. That's a thing that happens.
Yeah, I can't borrow from anybody. That's not
right. Right. And so that makes sense. My wife and I got engaged. Her parents and my parents gave us money for the wedding. We didn't use it to get married. We actually delayed the wedding by almost 2 years and took the money and bought a house, which made her father very, very angry at me, but it was a smart move. But so that's part of what we want to go out here in down payment assistance. So is like, part of that is about addressing a racial wealth gap. In terms of what gives you the most oomph, what we're recommending here is increasing the amount of assistance per household, because it's got to be pretty significant, because Charlottesville is a pretty significant place, pretty costly place. So right now it's averaging around 25, 30. We're talking about moving up to 50 or 60,000 a household. So that way you can really help households actually, because you want to get a household close to 20%, because if they get to 20%, they don't have to pay mortgage insurance. And mortgage insurance is the biggest waste of money in the world, because it doesn't insure anybody in your community. It insures an investor somewhere else. And they're not my client. So it's not a good use of money. Mm-hmm. So pushing it to a higher level, but then that household lives there, they pay their mortgage. So they pay down their mortgage over time. That helps build up their wealth, and the house appreciates in value. They get to keep what they paid down and the appreciation, but they have to repay all of that money, because it's $50,000 is not a small amount of money to give someone. They have to repay that $50,000 so that the next household who needs that help can access it. So it still helps them build wealth. There's lots of different ways you can balance this. We think that that's the best balance, because we think it lets you help the most households and still lets them build enough wealth that they'll be able to buy another house. And we're going to make that recommendation. We'll lay out some charts, like more detailed financial charts, to show exactly how the options play out. But ultimately, we're going to look at the community's feedback, because we did this work in Detroit, and in Detroit, they want us to forgive, just give the money away. Even if you have to help fewer households, we want you to just give the money away. Whereas we do work with community land trusts in DC, where they don't even want to give all the appreciation to the homeowner. They want to keep, the most important thing isn't really quite home ownership, in my opinion.
Well, there seems to be a lot of attention, Philip, between people that have lived in their home, a low-income home, and since they were younger, and suddenly there's value in that home. So they want to sell that home for a higher appreciation and maybe take that money and go to Greene County or something. Mm-hmm. Well, how does this deal with that? Because there's a lot of tension in
what we're recommending is they could still sell their home and move because it's their money, it's their wealth, and
That's what I
they
would
sell
say.
their home or do a refinance, and they want to pay off college debt or start a business, or they have the same rights everybody else has. They can do whatever but the money that was given to them has to come back to help somebody else be affordable. So the money that was
To eliminate gentrification because
I would eliminate maybe a stretch, limit and reduce probably more realistic. So basically, yeah, that's what would happen there. Does that make? We can give some more, but what I'm hearing is this down payment assistance is also one you all want to look at a little bit more.
Piedmont Housing Alliance does that, and they don't go through all their money.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, why is that? They have extra money for down payment sitting there.
We don't think they're structuring the program the right way, to be direct.
All right, no, that's fine. That's what I'm curious about.
We think that they're giving too shallow of a subsidy and they're not doing enough on the counseling side to build up folks to have access to it.
I think I agree. I agree with you because I talked to the people at HUD and other places and saying, why isn't Charlottesville getting their fair share? You know, why is this not working? And their answer is because they're not doing it right.
Yeah.
And don't make us look at Charlottesville. That's honestly, don't make us look at what they're doing, kind of.
Yeah. So we say, we don't say anybody's doing anything wrong, but we do say the way we think it should be done, which is different than what's happening right now. Hopefully that's an okay way to have the conversation.
No, I just don't understand it. Why?
I mean, I think it's that they're offering closer to 20 or 30,000. We just don't, the cost in your, like the assistance they are offering has not increased with the cost in the market.
So you need more money, okay.
You need more money, but that's a really hard, like the idea that you're going to give a household $50,000 is like, people get uncomfortable with that. That sounds crazy. But houses cost $300,000, so that's crazy.
Signed up. Chantel, she just signed up. She doesn't think it's crazy, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? That I just don't understand it.
Yeah. This is also like, are y'all gonna have other people vote?
Yeah. There's no voting. Like, this is us. We're canvassing. We're trying to understand how people feel about stuff. Like, we're going to take this. We're going to all come back and talk to each other. You two are going to present to everybody else.
No,
we're going to write a draft version of this and send it out to the whole community. And people are going to send us some very angry and recriminating comments, I'm sure, and hopefully some positive and helpful comments. And we're going to take the feedback and we're going to end up coming with the plan. And then we're going to come back with something that's more complete for you all to read and think about, and then give us, so like this is, and then it's going to go through another round when it goes to council. So this is round one of at least 4 rounds of conversation. And other people are talking about this in different small groups too. So you're not going to knock us terribly askew. We're just trying, like, how you all are thinking about it is helpful to us, if that makes sense. We are almost out of time, so I'm going to talk about funding. Where's funding at? Funding. Okay. So we talked, Susan, you made a comment that I thought was very apt, and everybody thinks there's more money than there is. And that's right, because if the money was only going to your program, there'd be plenty of money, but there's a lot of need in the world. And so what we want to talk about is, how does Charlottesville approach funding? And we have some thoughts about what we think is most important, because we've set up housing trust funds like CAF and other places, and we've worked on them that have gone badly and those have gone well. One, that it's important that it's consistent and predictable.
Yeah, totally.
If it goes up and down over time, then nonprofits have a hard time scaling their capacity. People have a hard time planning for it. So consistent and predictable is really important for the ecosystem of nonprofits and advocacy organizations and for-profits that use the money. And frankly, it's important for local government to create useful budgets. Transparent and competitive allocation. How funding is awarded to which groups and what they're held responsible to do is really important. So how many units are being produced, at what cost, and what level of impact is being achieved is a really important conversation and a really important piece. And that everybody believes this is going through a competitive process, because it is going through a competitive process. And even nonprofits are having to compete with each other to do the best job possible. That there is competition to make sure that things are being efficiently done, effectively done. Clear priorities and commitments, bold commitments. So if we're putting a racial equity lens on everything we're doing, then almost every investment we should be making in affordable housing should be how that investment lines up with addressing racial equity, wealth gaps, access to opportunity should be very clear. And that means, frankly, a little less discretion from nonprofits and other community organizations about asking for funds for one-off or bespoke activities, and more of the activities being driven by the city's overall policy goals that should come out of this plan. And then, of course, regular monitoring and reporting. It should be clear to everybody where the Housing Trust Fund money is going. So which projects it's going into, how many units it's producing, what the race of the households being served are, what the income levels are. It just needs to be reported and monitored. None of this is rocket science, but it's actually a fair amount of work to do all of that. Like, that's a fairly large administrative lift. And so, you know, we're going to talk about what we need to make recommendations on is the scale of the funding needed, the consistency. You know, is this is a 5 or 10 year commitment, the transparency, and then what kind of targeting is going on. So I want to talk a little bit about each one of these, the scale, the consistency, and the targeting. On the scale, I've said this before, is like there's no new magic funding. It's either reallocating existing funding or new taxes. And there's a bunch of different funding schemes, and you'll always hear people talking about those. And we get hired all the time to look at, like, can we do a special tax on Airbnb? Can we do a new recording tax now that state laws changes? And the answer to all these things is probably yes, but ultimately somebody's paying you more money that wasn't paying you before. Now, if it's somebody who doesn't live in Charlottesville, like through Airbnb, people are generally a little more excited, but the property owner for Airbnb doesn't like it as much. There's also just understanding the scale of the funding that you all are doing right now. You know, spending on housing, on the operating budget and the affordable are different places here. So if you look at the operating budget of the city overall, housing represents 1%, but you also have, you know, huge amounts of money. Does that mean money should come, more money should be going there? Maybe, but also a huge amount of money is going into other human services. So other activities are actually helping low-income households. So what is the relativity? 1% is actually relatively high compared to other local governments' budgets, even as crazy as that sounds. If you look at the capital improvement plan, which is a different way to look at the budget, that's money for big physical projects. It's a larger portion. It's closer to 9%. It's one of the bigger, you know, it's a relatively significant portion compared to other activities. If you look at what's gone, if you look at how consistent things have been over time, like how this level of funding has gone over time, it's shifted a lot. And there's a real issue here about how to, like, it's great that this much money was put in, but there's a real question and issue about how to make it more consistent. So as we start to look at scale.
Could I speak to taxes for a minute before you leave it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which isn't here. It's not as much as the tax rate, is that somehow in the city, I mean, in terms of assessments, I mean, to have an assessment go up 30% and have it then go up 20%, and then to have the city stand there and say, we're not raising taxes, seems a little disingenuous.
Yeah, X times Y equals Z. So there's the tax rate, there's the valuation, and then there's the taxes you actually have to pay. And the part you care about is the taxes you actually have to pay. Right.
I don't think people get into the weeds on that, but I don't know how that should be looked at. I mean, a 30% a year assessment increase is pretty high, isn't it?
It's quite impressive. Hope that it's that would be quite an impressive increase. Hopefully your property value actually increased that much.
I don't think so, but it doesn't mean I don't have to pay it.
It doesn't mean you don't have to pay it, but you know, as we start to look at other we start to look at the level of funding that's necessary.
Mhm.
One thing that's helpful, and these are approximate orders of magnitude on them, is what the cost is to provide things. And this varies greatly from deal to deal, but it's helpful to have an order of magnitude here. So a voucher, so the city has a rental assistance program that helps households stay in place, helps them cover a portion of the rent. That costs around $9,000, but this helps the lowest income households. That costs around $9,000 a year, every year, because as soon as you stop paying it, the household doesn't have enough money, or the next household needs help. But it's $9,000 a year. There's emergency rental assistance programs that you're really giving a household $800 on average, but that's just for that's not permanent affordability. That's somebody lost their job and you help covering a portion of the rent for 2 months. On average, you're costing around $800. There's building a public housing unit, which is costing about $70,000 in public money per unit. Frankly, that's actually a very good rate to be getting public housing units for. There's a low-income housing tax credit unit, which is a slightly higher income level, 50 to 60% AMI. That's about $40,000 a unit. There's a preservation fund, which doesn't create. So these are some of the prices that we start to get into. And if you start to look at this, I'm going to share something different. Just a second. If you start to look at this, let's see, sorry. Let me see. I'm the least skilled at sharing screens.
No, I am.
Right. If you start to look at this, can you see my screen now?
Yep.
If you start to look at this for different programs, you can see like how many units, how many households are we actually going to serve, and how much benefits. Like, so there's 3,000 households served, but 200 housing units created. You're helping, 140 renter households, but 2,000 owner households, 100 rental. You're going to create 100 rental units. So you can start to think of like the different ways you have impact. And really what some version is going to have to go on is how much money is going to be allocated and what impact you're actually going to expect to achieve from that.
That's interesting. Mhm.
And so there will be a version of this calculator that you folks can play with. And these are all, and we'll emphasize this to the end of the earth, approximate numbers, but it starts to let you look at like what the potential impact is, because no amount of funding is going to come anywhere near the scale of need. But if you said the city was going to dedicate $5 million a year annually in local money, and you said, well, we need to increase what we've been putting in tenant-based vouchers. We've been putting 800,000. We're going to increase that a little bit. We don't want to cut our property tax relief program. We want to keep that going. Public housing is going to need at least the current level of money they've been getting. That's got to keep going. Oops, they got an extra zero there. Then you start, like, we've already spent our full $5 million just on those first three. We're not doing any tax credit developments. We're not doing a preservation fund. We're not doing down payment assistance for anybody. So maybe you decide that the number has got to be higher, but then the question is, how does that, if you're going to go back to the city's budget, which I apologize, I can't pull a slide, like, would you put a new tax or fee in place, or would you reallocate from something else? And it's easy to say reallocation, but reallocation always means giving something up. And there's usually not a lot of things that people just want to give up.
Well, it seems to me when I look at these numbers, that's why I said there just is not enough money here in a city of 50,000 people. I mean, we can look at these numbers forever, right, Philip? And we'll never get to enough.
There's
So
enough money to make a real difference. There's not enough money to end all housing challenges.
it's what they want to do. So it seems to me that we need to do a better job, whether or not it's staff in the city or consultants such as yourself, to figure out how do we get a bigger share of other pots of money.
We can figure out how to get a bigger share of posts, but there's no magic money that's coming to it from the other places. You just frankly have to have somewhat prioritization conversation. So we talked through a lot, and I know we bounced all over the place, and I appreciate you all sticking with me. We're about to get pulled back into the other room.
All right, good job.